The Ronnie Van Zant Story, Rock, Rebellion, and Prophecy. Part 1. The Fighter's Son. Jacksonville, Florida, 1948. The post-war American South was finding its rhythm again, and into this world came a boy who would one day shake the very foundations of rock and roll. His name was Ronnie Van Zant, and from his very first breath, he was destined to be anything but ordinary. His father, Lacey Van Zant, earned his living behind the wheel of a truck, hauling goods across the sun-scorched highways of the South. But this was no ordinary working man. Before the responsibilities of family had settled upon his shoulders, Lacey had made his name in a far more brutal arena, as a prizefighter. The elder Van Zant knew what it meant to take a punch, to feel your knuckles connect with another man's jaw, and he made certain that every one of his sons understood this fundamental truth of manhood. You had to know how to defend yourself, and more importantly, how to finish a fight. Young Ronnie absorbed these lessons well. He would accompany his father on those long hauls, riding shotgun in the cab of the truck, watching the endless ribbon of asphalt unwind before them. But it wasn't the road that captured his imagination. It was the radio. Song after song poured through those crackling speakers, and with each passing mile, something began to crystallize in the boy's mind. Music wasn't just entertainment. It was power. It was freedom. It was destiny. By the time Ronnie reached 16 years of age, he had made his decision. He gathered together a group of like-minded youngsters and formed a band called Us. He appointed himself lead singer with the kind of natural authority that would become his trademark. But youth is fickle, and dreams are fragile things. Us became I when the band dissolved almost as quickly as it had formed. A lesser spirit might have been discouraged. Not Ronnie Van Zant. He immediately set about forming another group, this time with Bob Burns, Gary Rossington, Alan Collins, and Larry Junstrom. They called themselves My Backyard, and despite their collective youth, some members were barely 13 years old, they played with the ferocity and commitment of seasoned professionals. When they should have been in classrooms learning algebra and history, they were instead crafting something far more dangerous, a sound that would eventually capture the soul of the American South. Part 2. The Birth of a Legend. The newly christened Noble Five, as they'd renamed themselves, began accepting whatever gigs they could find. Local dances became their proving ground. Payment came in the form of gas money and free drinks. Hardly a king's ransom, but for young men drunk on music and possibility, it was enough. They weren't in this for the money. Not yet. They were in it for something far more intoxicating. The roar of amplifiers, the thunder of drums, and the electric connection between performer and audience. But there was a problem. Van Zant's voice, that powerful, unmistakable instrument, didn't respect boundaries or property lines. When the band rehearsed, his vocals echoed through suburban streets like the voice of some restless spirit. Neighbors complained. Police arrived with increasing frequency. The band found themselves bouncing from house to house, practicing wherever parents would tolerate their racket for more than a few hours. Salvation came from an unexpected source, Ronnie's father, Lacey. Drawing on his fighter's instinct for finding advantage in adversity, he helped the boys locate a new rehearsal space, an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, complete with a sprawling farm. The bandmates dubbed it Hell House. It was, by all accounts, small and stifling and ancient, but it was theirs. Far from the sanitized monotony of suburban Jacksonville, Van Zant and his fellow musical rebels cranked their amplifiers to maximum volume and forged their sound in that crucible of heat and noise and youthful ambition. During these formative years, the band experimented less with their musical approach and more with their identity. They played club dates under a rotating carousel of names: Wildcats, Sons of Satan, Conqueror Worm, The Pretty Ones, 1%. Each performance was a test, a chance to gauge crowd reaction, to see which version of themselves resonated most powerfully. But their true identity, the name that would echo through rock history, was born not from artistic inspiration, but from pure, adolescent defiance. Part 3. An Act of Defiance. Robert E. Lee High School maintained strict regulations governing student appearance. The dress code was explicit and unyielding. Sideburns could not extend below the ears, hair could not touch the back of the collar, belts had to be worn, shirt tails had to be tucked in, and socks were mandatory at all times. For any young man aspiring to rock and roll immortality, these rules represented everything wrong with the establishment. Ronnie Van Zant was not a man who bowed to such petty tyranny. He developed a clever strategy, applying Vaseline to his hair before school to keep it slicked back and off his collar. The ruse fooled most teachers, who assumed he maintained the required short haircut. But there was one man who saw through the deception: the gym coach. This particular educator made it his personal mission to patrol the showers after physical education classes. Time and again, he caught Van Zant and his fellow rockers with their luxurious locks dripping wet, hanging well below the forbidden collar line. Each infraction resulted in a trip to the principal's office. Suspensions accumulated like battle scars. Finally, guitarist Gary Rossington reached his breaking point. He gave the gym teacher an emphatic middle finger and dropped out of school entirely. A few nights later, the band was playing their regular gig at the Forest Inn. The crowd consisted largely of current and former students from Robert E. Lee High School, young people who understood exactly what it meant to chafe under the weight of arbitrary authority. Van Zant approached the microphone with a gleam in his eye. He announced that the band would be changing their name, and that the inspiration for this new identity came directly from their straight-laced, crew-cut gym teacher. His name was Leonard Skinner. The crowd erupted. In that single moment of brilliant revenge, Lynyrd Skynyrd was born. Part 4. The Road to Stardom. With their new name and an increasingly refined sound, Van Zant and his bandmates became fixtures on the Jacksonville music scene. Sometime during the mid-1960s, Ronnie met a young woman named Nadine Insko. By January of 1967, they had married, and within a few years, they welcomed a daughter named Tammy. But domestic tranquility was never meant to be Van Zant's destiny. Around the time of his marriage, he seemed to be attempting a conventional life, working at his brother-in-law's auto parts store, playing the role of responsible husband and father. The experiment didn't last long. The call of the stage proved too powerful to resist. Van Zant and Insko divorced in 1969. Intriguingly, this occurred right around the time he met Judy Seymour, who would become his second wife. By 1970, Van Zant and his Lynyrd Skynyrd bandmates had recorded a demo tape that caught the attention of Capricorn Records. The label offered them a deal. Van Zant turned it down. The decision shocked everyone around him, but Ronnie had his reasons. He knew they weren't ready. The sound wasn't quite there yet. They needed more time, more miles, more nights in dive bars perfecting their craft. For the next 3 years, the band embarked on a punishing schedule. They traveled from gig to gig, often driving for hours to play in front of sparse crowds in rundown venues. They upgraded their equipment piece by piece. They practiced until their fingers bled and their voices grew hoarse. Slowly, methodically, they evolved into masters of Southern rock. Yet Van Zant never fully embraced that label. Despite the distinctly Southern content of their lyrics, he insisted that Lynyrd Skynyrd's sound was more continental. He claimed they had modeled themselves after the British invasion bands of the 1960s, groups like the Rolling Stones and the who had themselves borrowed from American blues and transformed it into something new. Part 5. The Breakthrough. By 1973, Lynyrd Skynyrd had perfected their approach, and the music industry finally took notice. MCA Records approached them with an offer that Van Zant couldn't refuse. This time, he signed the contract. Their debut album arrived like a thunderbolt. It featured tracks that would become rock standards. Gimme 3 Steps, Simple Man, And most importantly, Free Bird, a song Van Zant had written in just 3 minutes, somehow channeling years of emotion and musical ambition into a single, transcendent piece of art. During one particular performance, later immortalized on their 1976 live album, One More from the Road, Van Zant asked the crowd what they wanted to hear. When the audience shouted back, "Free Bird," the band launched into a 14-minute rendition that cemented their place in the pantheon of rock legends. Van Zant's playful interaction with the crowd would echo through the decades. Years later, when other rock icons like Nirvana and Bob Dylan asked audiences what they wanted to hear, crowds would shout back "Free Bird" in tribute to Lynyrd Skynyrd's legacy. On stage, Van Zant cut a distinctive figure. He famously performed barefoot, refusing to wear shoes during concerts. But don't mistake the long hair and bare feet for hippie sensibilities. Van Zant was no flower child preaching peace and love. In 1975, he found himself in handcuffs after throwing a table through a second-story hotel window. The truth was that Ronnie Van Zant had become nearly as famous for his volcanic temper as for his powerful vocals. His bandmates experienced this firsthand. On one occasion, Van Zant caught a musician drinking wine on stage during a performance and responded by punching him in the mouth. He allegedly delivered similar treatment when he spotted a bandmate ogling a female fan. Believe it or not, a punch to the face represented Van Zant going easy on someone. Part 6. The Devil You Know. By the mid-1970s, Lynyrd Skynyrd had developed a well-earned reputation as hard-drinking brawlers who loved a good fight when they weren't performing. When external adversaries were scarce, they simply fought each other, often leaving their dressing rooms utterly demolished. Their press agent made little effort to conceal these escapades, believing the mayhem added to their mystique. But the rock and roll lifestyle was exacting a heavy price. By 1976, Van Zant had been arrested more than a dozen times. Former Lynyrd Skynyrd drummer Artemis Pyle later spoke about the emotional turbulence that defined life with Ronnie. "I loved and respected Ronnie Van Zant," he said, "but I've seen the man turn into the devil right in front of me and hurt people." Despite their offstage chaos, the band continued producing hit after hit. Sweet Home Alabama became an anthem. Between 1974 and 76, they released 4 more albums, each one climbing the charts. But for some members, the meteoric rise came at too steep a cost, literally. In 1976, Lynyrd Skynyrd suffered 2 devastating setbacks. First, guitarist Alan Collins, fueled by alcohol, crashed his car into a parked vehicle with such force that he sent it careening across an entire parking lot. Then, Gary Rossington, under the influence of drink and drugs, fell asleep at the wheel of his brand new automobile. As the vehicle sped along uncontrolled, Rossington struck a telephone pole, split an oak tree, and caused $7,000 in damage to a house. His injuries were so severe that the band had to cancel their upcoming tour. Van Zant's response to his injured bandmates wasn't sympathy or concern. He fined each of them $5,000. Part 7. The Prophecy. In 1995, Van Zant's father, Lacey, gave an interview that sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. "Ronnie was the only one of my children who had second sight," he said, referring to what could only be described as his son's prophetic abilities. For years, Ronnie Van Zant had been telling friends and family members that he would not live to see his 30th birthday. He repeated this grim prediction so frequently that his loved ones grew tired of hearing it. Some dismissed it as rock star melodrama. Others tried to laugh it off as morbid humor. But as late 1977 approached, Van Zant's prophecies took on an increasingly ominous quality. On October 17th, Lynyrd Skynyrd released their album Street Survivors and prepared to embark on a promotional tour. The original cover art depicted the band members standing on a city street with buildings engulfed in flames behind them. It was striking imagery, perhaps too striking. Just 3 days later, the album cover and all of Van Zant's dark predictions took on a horrifying new significance. In the months leading up to that fateful October, backup singer Jojo Billingsley noticed something peculiar about Van Zant's behavior. He had started referring to himself as the Mississippi Kid, despite having been born and raised in Florida. Van Zant had no connection to Mississippi whatsoever. Not yet anyway. Part 8. October 20th, 1977. On October 20th, 1977, Ronnie Van Zant and his bandmates boarded a chartered flight from South Carolina, headed to their next concert in Louisiana. It should have been a routine journey, the kind they had made hundreds of times before. Somewhere outside the small town of Gillsburg, Mississippi, Van Zant's years of predictions came true with terrible finality. The plane ran out of fuel. The pilot's voice crackled through the cabin, instructing everyone to brace for a crash landing. As the aircraft hurtled toward the earth, it struck a tree. The impact caused Van Zant to suffer a fatal head injury. He died instantly. He was, exactly as he had predicted, 29 years old, just 87 days shy of his 30th birthday. The tragedy claimed other lives as well. Guitarist and backup vocalist Steve Gaines perished in the crash, along with his sister, vocalist Cassie Gaines. The band members who survived sustained serious injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The funeral was an emotionally devastating affair. Attendees literally collapsed from grief. Van Zant's loved ones laid him to rest with his beloved fishing pole, wearing his trademark black hat, the image of a Southern rock legend, even in death. But the story doesn't end there. Even death couldn't grant Ronnie Van Zant the peace he deserved. In late June of 2000, vandals broke into Van Zant's tomb and exhumed his body. His family was forced to relocate his remains to prevent further desecration, a final indignity visited upon a man who had lived his entire life on his own uncompromising terms. Epilogue: The Rolling Stones incident. Van Zant sometimes performed wearing a t-shirt that posed a provocative question: who the hell are the Rolling Stones anyway? The feud traced back to 1976, when Lynyrd Skynyrd opened for the Rolling Stones at the Nebworth Festival in England. The stage was constructed in the shape of the Rolling Stones' iconic logo, a giant mouth with its tongue extended. Mick Jagger, with the imperious attitude of established rock royalty, informed the band that there was one thing they absolutely could not do: perform on that iconic tongue. Ronnie Van Zant, who had spent his entire life defying authority figures, wasn't about to start following orders from Mick Jagger. In the middle of their set, he ushered his bandmates out onto the tongue to perform Free Bird in all its extended glory. Needless to say, Lynyrd Skynyrd never performed with Jagger or the Rolling Stones again. After Van Zant's death, Lynyrd Skynyrd disbanded, the surviving members unable to imagine continuing without their leader. A decade later, they reunited with Ronnie's younger brother Johnny taking over vocal duties, a poignant reminder that the Van Zant legacy, like the band's music, refused to die. Ronnie Van Zant lived fast, fought hard, and died young, exactly as he had always predicted. He left behind a catalogue of music that continues to define Southern rock, and a legend that grows larger with each passing year. He was a fighter's son who became a rock and roll prophet, a barefoot rebel who stared down death and dared it to come for him. And when death finally came, on a cool October evening over the Mississippi woods, Ronnie Van Zant met it exactly as he had lived, on his own terms, defiantly, and far too soon.